I call this meeting to order. This is meeting number 41 of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. And because there are so many members that are in the room today, I'll just go over quickly our hybrid rules. So pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021, members attending in person in the room and remotely in the Zoom application. The proceedings of today will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware, the webcast will always show the person that is speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. And given the ongoing pandemic situation and in light of the recommendations from health authorities, as well as the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on January 28th, 2021, to health safe, all those attending the meeting in person are to remain 2 meters physically distanced. So please make sure you're doing that. And you must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room. It's highly recommended that the mask be worn at all times, including when seated. You must remain proper hand hygiene by using the provided hand sanitizer at the room entrance. As the chair, I'll be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting, and I thank members in advance for their cooperation. To ensure an orderly meeting, we'll outline a few rules. Interpretation services for members are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen with the globe icon to select either English or French. This is the language that you would like to listen to. You can speak in any language and interpretation will follow suit. Just make sure that when you're speaking slowly and clearly so that translation is not an issue. And for members that are participating in person, proceed as you normally would with your mic at your desk. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon and unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. When you're not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. And with respect to the speaking list, Mr. Clerk and I will do our best to maintain it. And I have, well, I have to look for it, but I have a time card for members. I have a 1 minute and a 30-second to help you keep track of your time as our witnesses are making opening remarks and as members proceed with their questions. And just before we get right into the weeds, I'll just welcome Mr. McGregor back to our committee meeting. He'll be replacing Mr. Garrison today. Welcome, Mr. McGregor. So at this time, I will invite the Right Honourable Kim Campbell and the Honourable David Lametti, who are both here to speak specifically about the nomination process of the Honourable Mahfoud Jamal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I'll just note for members, House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition states on page 1078, there are no specific rules governing the nature of questions which may be put to witnesses appearing before committees beyond the general requirement of relevance to the issue that is before the committee, and that is the Supreme Court nomination. So with that, I welcome our first speaker of the day, the Honourable David Lametti. Please go ahead. You'll have 7.5 minutes to make your remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bonjour, honorable collègues. Good morning. D'abord, j'aimerais reconnaître.
To begin with, I would like to recognize that I am on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa.
The members of the committee, as well as the chair, for convening this special session. As always, your contribution in helping to shape the character of one of Canada's most important and enduring institutions is deeply valued. Et j'aimerais aussi, tout d'abord,
and I would also like to recognize and thank the Right Honourable Kim Campbell for her presence here with us here this morning, and also for the work that she has carried out during the process that I will be touching on later.
Canada is a place close to my heart. It is a place where, years ago, I began my own legal career as a law clerk to a cherished mentor and friend, the late Honorable Peter de Carteret-Corey. His example serves to remind me that our great public institutions depend on the dedication and integrity of those who occupy them. It is my privilege today to speak in support of the Honorable Mahmoud Jamal, a nominee who I am confident will honor the highest ideals of the Supreme Court and help guide the evolution of Canada's laws with wisdom, fairness, humility, and a deep understanding of the society he serves. I offer my heartfelt congratulations to Justice Jamal, and I look forward to his appearance before parliamentarians this afternoon. I would also be remiss not to take this opportunity to acknowledge the lifetime of contribution and service to Canada and to the rule of law of Justice Jamal's predecessor, the Honorable Rosie Silberman Abella. Justice Abella is a trailblazer and a jurist of remarkable intellect and character, and she has left an indelible mark on Canada's legal landscape. She will be deeply missed on our highest court, but I have no doubt that she will continue to make important contributions to our public life in other roles. Le juge Jamal est la quatrième.
Justice Jamal will be the fourth person appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada by Prime Minister Trudeau in the framework of the modernized selection process, which the government brought into effect in 2007. This procedure prioritizes the person's merit as well as their social representativity and values of transparency, and requires that each person to be nominated to our highest court of the land presents their candidacy with a rigorous questionnaire which is made available to the public. It is required that they show not only that they are an expert in law, but that their personal experiences and life experience have made it easier for them to understand the law and Canadian society overall. And the procedure also requires that all candidates be evaluated based on uniform, transparent, and merit-based criteria by an independent advisory board made up of people who are highly qualified, reflecting the highest standards of Canadian professional practice in law.
Supreme Court appointments, or IAB, is the heart of the selection process. I am pleased to be today by its chair, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, who has contributed so much to the success of the Supreme Court appointment process through her stewardship of 4 nominations, including today's. Ms. Campbell never fails to inform and support this committee with characteristic intelligence and candor, and we owe her a deep debt of gratitude. I'm looking forward to hearing her remarks today. I'm also deeply grateful to the individuals who serve with Ms. Campbell as members of the IAB. These members are nominated not just by the government, but by organizations committed to the rule of law and to serving Canadians. They include the Canadian Bar Association, the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, the Canadian Judicial Council, and the Council of Canadian Law Deans. The thoughtful nominees of these organizations and the dedicated service of these individuals on the IAB ensure that the judicial selection process mirrors a critical aspiration for the Supreme Court itself, that it truly reflect our society and be a place in which Canadians can see themselves and life experiences represented. Le processus de sélection actuel a...
The current selection process was introduced by Prime Minister Trudeau in February 2000 and in order to fill the position vacancy which will be created by the upcoming retirement of Justice Abella. The IAB has been in charge of suggesting nominees who are of the highest caliber, who reasonably reflect the diversity of Canada's society and are bilingual. And there is regional presentation of nominees as well, which has been in place for many years. And thus, this time round, it was open to all nominees from Ontario. And persons interested in the position had 10 weeks to submit their candidacy, their nomination and possibility, and then the IAB examined these, consulting Justices of Canada, reference people, specialists, and did meet some of the candidates, carrying out their activity in confidence. And each of their members has signed a confidentiality agreement before undertaking this work. Having completed the process, the advisory board provided the Prime Minister with a short list and ensured that they had followed all the criteria which are publicly available. I have examined the consultations on about the shortlist in order to advise the Prime Minister.
Chief Justice of Canada, the Attorney General of Ontario, Cabinet colleagues, opposition justice critics, members of this committee and the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs, and with senior members of the bar. The Prime Minister then made his final selection. I wish to stress again the confidentiality of this process, which is essential to ensuring that exceptional candidates come forward and speak to their life experiences and skills with honesty and candor. Members of Parliament, senators, and members of the bar were each required to complete a non-disclosure agreement. And all persons involved in conducting the process, including myself, the Prime Minister, and members of the IAB, understand the importance of confidentiality to providing candidates with the fair treatment that they deserve and the rigorous scrutiny that an appointment to the Supreme Court demands. So I would like to now turn to the Right Honourable Kim Campbell to speak to the process from her perspective. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you very much, Minister Lametti. The Right Honourable Kim Campbell, please go ahead for your opening remarks.
I've only been doing this Zoom for over a year and I still forget to unmute myself. And I want to say, first of all, Madam Chair and members of the committee, how nice it is to be with you. And Madam Chair, you and I have met before, and congratulations on chairing the committee. It's a great honor, and I'm sure you find it most challenging. It's one of the best committees to be sitting on. I'm sure you all agree. I don't want to get into huge details, but I'm happy to answer your questions. But if I could give you sort of a broad brushstroke approach. A couple of years ago, during the Canada 150 celebrations, I was doing a panel at the Supreme Court of Canada on the occasion of Canada 150 on the relationship between the government and the courts. And my co-panelist was the Honourable Bob Rae. And Bob Rae and I have disagreed upon on a number of subjects over the course of our years. He was Premier of Ontario when I was Prime Minister, and I think I quoted him. I referred to him as behaving like he'd had a lemon in his mouth when he was meeting with me. But we've gotten on much better over the years. But one of the things he said at that panel at the Supreme Court was that he preferred the old tap them on the shoulder approach to appointing Supreme Court of Canada justices. That the sort of the mystique that you became a distinguished jurist in your province, you became distinguished at the bar, and then one day the Minister of Justice or his representative would come along and the Prime Minister would tap you on the shoulder and ask you to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. However, as many of you will well understand, not all shoulders are equally tappable. And a lot of people who could make extraordinary contributions to the development of the law in our country are not necessarily on the radar screen of those who have traditionally done the tapping. So that was another subject in which I disagreed with the Honourable Bob Rae. But I do think that for this process to work well, it has to work well at all of its stages. So the first mandate that we have as the Independent Advisory Board is to try and increase the number of candidates. And that is a bit harder than it sounds, because very often people of distinction at the bar, jurists, don't like to be seen, they're very Canadian. They don't like to be seen to be putting themselves forward. So right from the very first process, the 4 processes ago, we worked very hard to try and encourage people who recognize colleagues as being outstanding candidates to encourage them to apply. And the system that I developed was that when we got a recommendation, we often would get a recommendation from a judge or from a member of the bar. One recommendation that came from a student at the McGill Law School. So anyone who's interested in the court can certainly communicate. What we do then is, or I write a letter to the person who's been nominated, and I say, your name has been forwarded to us as an outstanding candidate for the vacancy on the Supreme Court of Canada. Please review these materials, and if it interests you, we warmly encourage you to apply. And what this means is that for many people who are otherwise a bit shy about seeming to put themselves forward, they can say, well, I was asked to apply, and certainly they were. So I think that is one of the challenges, but also we have a very long list of organizations of lawyers and jurists across the country that we contact every time there's a vacancy, and we ask them to circulate to their own members and to identify members in their own organizations who would make good candidates for the Supreme Court of Canada. Because again, there are very often groups of people who don't necessarily see themselves reflected in the current cast of characters and don't the Prime Minister's perspective, the greater the diversity on the court, the greater it is for Canada. So people who are from underrepresented groups are certainly encouraged to consider themselves to apply. So that is our purpose, is to try and maximize the number of candidates. But even so, for many people, perhaps less the case in Ontario, but for many people, going to the Supreme Court of Canada is a huge decision because, as you know, you have to relocate to the National Capital Region. It creates a much narrower life in the sense that you have to maintain your independence. And so it's very important for the judges that they be able to create a community to provide support. And not all judges find it equally congenial when they go. And so it's a big personal sacrifice for many to uproot themselves. And many have reservations about it. And I think I mentioned the last time I spoke to you that there is now a considerable number, including the former Chief Justice, a considerable number of retired Supreme Court of Canada justices. And I think it would be very valuable if they would make a point of having roundtables, discussions across the country with members of the bar and the judiciary to talk about what life is like on the court, both to encourage people to apply, but also to create realistic expectations, because it is a unique judicial appointment. So for those who come from Ontario and who live not far from Ottawa or the National Capital Region, and or for that matter, Montreal, it is perhaps less daunting. But certainly, when we were doing the Western position, there were some judges or some candidates from British Columbia, for example, who were outstanding and bilingual in the works. And we sort of had the sense that they hoped we wouldn't nominate them because it would be such a challenge for them. And of course, nowadays, professionals tend to have spouses who are also professionals, whether it's wives with husbands or husbands with wives. So I think it is important to acknowledge what a commitment it is for someone to agree to sit on the Supreme Court of Canada. So one of the first things we do as a committee is we meet with the Chief Justice to discuss all of these things, to get his and previously her reflection on what the court needs, but also some of the aspects of the work of a Supreme Court of Canada justice that could help us identify those candidates who would be able to make the best contributions. The other thing that I would say, and some of you will have heard me say this before, I'm very, gratified to be recognized as the chair of this committee, but it really is a committee of 7 people. And my role as the chair was to make sure that each member of the committee could make a contribution. And as you know, we have 4 representatives of legal organizations, as the minister has mentioned, but there are always 2 members of the community who are not lawyers. And I cannot say enough about how excellent their contribution is in all 4 of the procedures that I've been involved in. The non-lawyers were incredibly astute and very thoughtful, and often raised very interesting points of view that enriched our discussions. And I think there would be unanimous agreement that that formula of ensuring that it isn't just lawyers talking to lawyers, but that there are people who have not been involved in the legal profession, but who are very engaged as citizens, that they often are quite astute at understanding what is at stake and how important it is. So in the process of the operation of the committee, when we start our work, when all of the applications are in, the materials are circulated on. This year we had to work virtually, so the materials were circulated just on our secure tablets. We didn't have the written versions that we used to have. And I will say that I did miss the personal contact that we had when we worked in Ottawa, that the opportunity to have meals together and fatten ourselves up with, cupcakes and chat. We missed that. But the members were all incredibly supportive and responsive to trying to create a sense of community. But one of the things that's always been important to me is to avoid any suggestion of groupthink or pressure or one person having more influence on another. Happily, they're all pretty independent people, so that's not so hard to do. But what I do try to do is to make sure that they review the materials independently. Then we come together and do our first go round of sort of yes, no, maybe to see where there's consensus and where there isn't. So the whole process is designed to try and make sure that 7 people work hard to try and achieve the consensus necessary to create a shortlist, but do so with each one feeling free to express fully their views and attitudes. I'll just conclude because I've had my warning sign, but to say, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions, but to say that the candidates are really outstanding. It's not only is it a hard job to be on the Supreme Court of Canada, but it's a bit of an effort to apply to be considered for the Supreme Court of Canada. It's a long and difficult questionnaire, and it requires all sorts of issues to be discussed, the assembly of references. But it's always been, in the 4 times that I've been involved, a very encouraging process to see the quality of people, some of them who are still maybe a bit junior, but with full of promise. And there's not been a single application that we felt was, delusional or whatever. On the contrary, what we do is we try to compare a peer group and we try to compare them to the outstanding members of the current court. But we really do have an enormous amount of talent and diverse talent, and interestingly enough, bilingual talent among the members of the legal profession in the country. So I'll stop here because I think you may want to have questions, but I just want to say that from my perspective, and this is the 4th time I've spoken to you about it, I thought the process went well. I felt that it was inspiring, but also challenging for the members who worked very hard to try. As I say, our goal has always been to give the Prime Minister a short list of from 3 to 5 candidates that will keep him up at night trying to figure out which of these outstanding people to name to the court. And I think this year we succeeded in doing that as well. So I'll end here and be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much for that. So we'll go into our first round of questions.
Madam Chair,
yeah.
I thought it was coming back to me so I could introduce the actual candidate.
Sorry, would you like to do I have the consent of the committee to give Mr. Lametti a couple of minutes to introduce the candidate? Go ahead, Mr. Lametti.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Madam Campbell. From this exceptional field described by Madam Campbell, Justice Jamal emerged as the individual best qualified to serve on our highest court in our justice system. I'm supremely confident that Justice Jamal, based on his lived experience and demonstrated commitment to the rule of law, will serve Canada and its peoples with the same verve and commitment as his predecessor on the court. Justice Jamal makes history as the first person of color to be appointed to our highest court and the first person of the Baha'i faith. His story is not only one of excellence in the legal profession, in scholarship and voluntary service to his community, but of navigating the role of difference in our society, often leveraging the role of counselor and advocate to bridge the inequalities that too often attach to our differences. Le juge Jamal a participé comme avocat à
Justice Jamal has been involved in litigation of constitutional matters of the highest importance over the last decade. The Supreme Court is not unknown to him. He has regularly shown his level of competency and devotion by working for people who are disadvantaged on a pro bono basis. He has deeply studied the legislation of our country, has taught law, and written greatly on these topics, and therefore shows a considerable intellectual breadth and willingness to continue to see the law evolve throughout Canada. Throughout his career, he has enthusiastically undertaken all chances to work in both English and French, including as an appellate judge and has admirably served on the Ontario Court of Appeal as a fair and considered judge with a high ability to analyze cases. I'm proud of this nomination, and I have high hopes that all Canadians will back me on it.
Somewhat lighter note to refer to a hockey analogy that was once used to highlight Justice Jamal's strong reputation. I feel that such an analogy is very timely, given that my hometown team, the Montreal Canadiens, is battling for a berth in the Stanley Cup final. It was a description of a lawyer's reaction when she discovered that Justice Jamal, who was then a member of the bar, would be the lawyer on the other side. Opposing counsel, quote, knows what it feels like to show up for a game of shinny and find Wayne Gretzky facing off against her, unquote. Madam Chair, aptly reflects in classic Canadian fashion Justice Jamal's exceptional legal skills. I thank the Right Honourable Kim Campbell and her colleagues on the IAB, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister Lametti. That was a great reference. If you know our committee, we are very much into hockey and are all rooting for the Habs. Except for myself, I was very much into the Leafs and was quite devastated when they lost. But we'll go into our first round of questions then, starting with Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper, you'll have 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister Lametti and Ms. Campbell. I want to, first of all, take this opportunity, Ms. Campbell, to acknowledge your work as chair, as well as that of your committee that has resulted in an appointment of someone who is highly distinguished and eminently qualified to serve on the Supreme Court in Justice Jamal. And I look forward to the opportunity to ask him questions later this afternoon. Minister Lametti, I'll direct my questions to you. In a June 10th CBC report, federal sources said that the Liberal Party's private database, Liberal List, that tracks Liberal Party members, supporters, volunteers, and donors, was no longer being used to vet judicial appointments. On what date did the use of Liberal Lists to vet candidates cease?
Madam Chair, on a point of order.
Please go ahead, Mr. Virani.
So it's a referendum here in the committee room. I'm just wondering if you could establish the relevance of Mr. Cooper's line of questioning. We're not talking about the general appointments process. We're talking about a very specific appointments process that relates to the Independent Advisory Board and the role of Madam Campbell on that board and how that produced an appointment of the caliber of Justice Jamal. So if you could make a determination as to whether this line of questioning is relevant to that process. Thank you.
Madam Chair, on the
same point of order, Mr. Cooper?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. As you noted in your opening remarks, there is a fair bit of leeway afforded to committee members to ask witnesses questions, and I would submit that having regard for that, the question is pertinent to the judicial appointment process more broadly, and I would say that in light of the substantiated allegations of political interference by the PMO, including the use of Liberal List, that the perception that the integrity of the appointment process has been undermined is real, and it is important.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Maloney.
I just want to echo Mr. Virani's comments. Mr. Cooper using the language that these have been substantiated, with all due respect, is not accurate. They're allegations, baseless allegations, in my opinion. They have no place in the discussion today. Mr. Cooper started his questioning by acknowledging the high caliber of the appointment of Justice Jamal, and I think this discussion takes away from that, and we should move on and focus on the issues at hand.
Thank you, Mr. Maloney. So I'll just, is it on the same point of order, Mr. Moore?
It is, Madam Chair. I think
if we can just, get going. I don't want to lose a lot
absolutely.
of
I'd
time.
like us to get going. And on that point of order, I mean, Mr. Cooper's barely got his question out. Minister Lametti is a seasoned pro. He knows how to answer questions. He's used to difficult questions. Let's allow Mr. Cooper the ability to ask his questions. He only has 5 minutes, and then the other members, they get to ask their questions. They can ask whatever lob ball they would wish of the ministers. So I'm just hoping we can get on with the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Moore, myself included. Now, Mr. Clerk, I see your hand raised. Is that a point of order from Monsieur Fortin?
Yes, it is. Merci, Madame la
Please go ahead,
Présidente.
Monsieur Fortin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, indeed. On the same point of order, Madam Chair, I simply wish to have it noted that Justice Jamal seems to me, his competency is beyond questioning, so I have no need to question that. And we will be able to put him a number of questions to him on a number of topics, and that's wonderful. I thank the committee and the minister for giving us this opportunity. But at this point, right now, we're meeting the chairperson of the advisory board and the Minister of Justice to discuss the nomination process. That's what Justice Lametti has discussed with us, and that is what the Right Honourable Kim Campbell has been talking about. We're talking about the nomination process. So whether or not you like Mr. Cooper's question, and I'm not a member of the Conservative Party, I just remind you of that, nevertheless, we are here to discuss the nomination process. So if some of us don't want to hear about it, well, we can leave the committee. But right now, that is our topic. The IAB and its nomination process, and I have questions about that process. Otherwise, why are we here?
Thank you very much, Mr. Fortin. And I'll just say to members, please keep your questions around the Supreme Court nomination process. We're not talking about the general appointment process for all of our judiciary. We're here specifically to deal with the Supreme Court nomination. So Mr. Cooper, please go ahead, and if you can just reframe your question to that scope that we're in discussion with today. You have 2 minutes left on, you have 2 minutes into the clock.
I'm 2 minutes into the clock. Well, I will just invite the minister to answer the question that I posed to him. I think Canadians deserve an answer to it.
Go ahead, Minister Lametti.
Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for your question. Always good to see you again. I have answered that question many times publicly, Madam Chair. In my evaluation of ordinary judicial appointments or elevations, I do not use Liberal list in the evaluation of candidates and in putting those names forward, Madam Speaker. And I can't speak to the source or the nature of that article to which he referred. I can say with respect to this process, the Supreme Court nomination process, Madam Speaker, that the board, the IAB, or in terms of my deliberations with the people that I've mentioned in using the short list to find out what people thought of the shortlisted candidates, Liberal list was nowhere near that process, Madam Speaker, and sure that both the ordinary judicial appointment process and this process are of the highest quality, are transparent, and serve the needs of Canadians. And if you look at both the appointment today, the recommended appointment today, and the appointments that I have made since becoming minister, Madam Speaker, they are of the very highest quality, people of all political stripes, people of all walks of life, with the highest amount of diversity in Canadian history.
Minister, are you...
Sorry, sorry, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Lametti, can you just check your mic and move it up a little bit, perhaps? We're not getting clear for interpretation.
Is that better?
That does sound a little bit better. Thank you. Please continue, Mr. Cooper.
Well, Minister, are you denying that Liberal list has been used?
As I have said publicly on a number of different occasions, Mr. Cooper, once I have made my recommendation, we do a number of due diligence inquiries, if you will. One is looking at political donations. One is looking at all the sorts of media that a person may have been involved with, just to get a sense of really managing information.
So, Minister,
but I have said,
well,
Mr.
I want to be
Cooper,
respectful of you, and I have a lot of
want to be
respect for you,
respectful to finish your answer, Mr. Cooper, which is,
I
have
did ask
said,
a very simple
Mr.
question
Cooper,
on the
and
very
I'm
simple,
giving you a very
Minister,
Cooper, I'm giving. Please let me answer the question,
I'm asking, are you
Mr.
denying
Cooper. With
yes
respect,
or no? Has liberal list been used?
I have told you that I do not use liberal list in the evaluation, identification of candidates.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Madam Speaker,
Cooper,
on a point of
Mr.
order,
Cooper.
could the witness be allowed to answer the question? Right, we're not here to badger witnesses, let alone the Minister of Justice. If the minister could be allowed to answer the question that was put to by Mr. Cooper.
Thank you,
Madam Chair.
Mr. Varani. I was just about to cut in myself. Mr. Cooper, I've stopped your clock so that we're able to have this conversation. I think the way that we've been able to function as a committee is that member asks a question and a witness answers that question. Let's keep that respectful dialogue going, if that's okay. Please go ahead, Minister Lametti, with your answer.
I only have one other thing to add, Madam Speaker, which is I have never had a candidate that I have submitted been refused in any way, shape, or form. So the process is an excellent process. It's based on quality. It's based on the recommendations of an independent judicial appointment committee in the various provinces across Canada. Some provinces have more than one. And I look at the quality of the candidates. I look at the needs of the courts. I consult with Chief Justices and the needs of the court. We consult with various members of the legal profession who are placed to give opinions. And I think we have put together an outstanding set of quality
Madam Chair,
and diverse candidates.
Chair, Minister, with respect, I've given you some leeway to answer a very simple question, and that is, has liberal list been used, yes or no, in the vetting of judicial appointments? Not necessarily just by you.
My role in the process, and my role in the process is, as I have pointed out, Mr. Cooper, the main role in the process in taking candidates that are recommended by the Judicial Appointment Committee and deciding from amongst those highly recommended and occasionally recommended candidates which candidates will move forward.
You have 10 seconds left on the clock, Mr.
Well, I guess
Cooper.
my time has expired, and unfortunately, I didn't get an answer from the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Hopefully the next round will go a little bit smoothly. I will now go to Madame Brière for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to our two witnesses. I'll share my time with my colleague Randeep Sarai. En tant que francophone,
speaking as a Quebecer and francophone and defender of the French language, I am delighted to see that the candidate nominated is bilingual. Could you tell us a little more about the importance of bilingualism as a criteria for selection? Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if you wish me or Ms. Campbell to respond, but let me go ahead. In my experience, as a clerk at the Supreme Court, as a legal auxiliary, I saw with my own eyes how important bilingualism is when it comes to drafting briefs and documents by the court. Every word, every phrase, every sentence must be weighed, and there are a lot of idioms very difficult to translate from one language to the other. Sometimes they reflect concepts, and there are concepts as well. So it's highly important that a justice be able to understand the language of litigation, the language of evidence and argument, and the brief, the legal brief, especially when you have little time to handle the case and there's a good deal of voluminous information to cover. Very important to understand the language. At least that's my opinion. I'm not sure if you have any comments on this, Ms. Campbell.
Je veux juste ajouter quelques mots.
I wish to add briefly that in my discussions with the Chief Justice, we discussed this matter, and he underscored the importance of being functionally bilingual on the Supreme Court of the land.
Excuse me, for some reason or other, I'm getting translation when I don't really want to hear. I think one of the things that's important also, and maybe many Canadians do not realize, that the workload of the Supreme Court of Canada is actually heavier than the workload of the Supreme Court of the United States, because there are many cases that come to our court. So because of the fact that pleadings come in both languages and counsel appear in both languages, the more the judges are themselves, the justices themselves are competent in the two languages, the more effective is their use of time. I think over the years, the court of translation, and even the judges, for example, the recent juge-en-chef, Madame McLaughlin, she has said that she continued to work on her French all the time she was on the court. But the more the court can function comfortably in both languages, I think the easier it is for them to manage the quite difficult workload that they have. So quite aside from our constitutional representational concerns, and they do long etc. I think for the nature of our court, anything that makes it possible for the judges to communicate one with another, but also with the counsel and the participants who are pleading before them, comfortably, fully, and clearly, I think is a very, very important value. So with our committee, this was it was one of our terms of reference that was non-negotiable, but I think we all quite understood the functional importance of it.
Thank you to both of you for your time and your expertise.
Mr. Sarai, please go ahead.
Being with us today, Minister Lametti and the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. This is a historic nomination for the country, as Madam Campbell, Ms. Campbell, you know, being one of the first, being the first Prime Minister, female Prime Minister of this country, you know what history is like. And this is a historical day that the first person of colour is being nominated to the Supreme Court of Canada. I understand that this is that it's up to the candidate to self-identify as a minority, and that during the process that led to the appointment of our most recent Supreme Court Justice, there were not any self-identified minorities. Besides the nominee that we have here today, Mr. Justice Jamal, were there many other self-identified minorities amongst the candidates? To the Right Honourable Kim Campbell.
Thank you. In the groups, there were 18 candidates. 7 self-identified as visible minority, 3 identified as ethnic, cultural, or others, 5 identified as Indigenous. There were 0 who identified as having disabilities, and 1 identified as LGBTQ. So, and I should just say that the importance of expanding the representation of the court. As the first woman Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada in 1992, I appointed Rosalie Abella to the Supreme Court, to the Court of Appeal of Ontario. So I'm very aware at that time the importance of expanding the number of voices, and we've continued on this committee to be very gratified at the diversity of candidates that we've been able to vet.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Is there a criteria for adding different and diverse perspectives to the Supreme Court? And how much is the backgrounds of the current judges taken into consideration when looking at nominee candidates?
Well, I would suggest that the final decision is the Prime Minister's, and the Prime Minister's terms of reference have been that he puts a very high premium on expanding the diversity of lived experience, the diversity of perspectives on the judges on the highest court of the land. So as a committee, we look to try and make that possible for the Prime Minister. And incidentally, there's no compromise made with quality. I mean, the notion that if you go for diversity, you're not going to have quality, that's a load of rubbish. In today's legal community in Canada, we have outstanding jurists and lawyers from all different backgrounds and characteristics. So that is not an issue at all. But it is certainly something that we know the Prime Minister will want to make choices, and we're very happy that we have been able to provide him with outstanding candidates that give him a choice, and as we say, hopefully keep him up at night worrying about which excellent person to support. But the diversity experiences is part of the terms of reference of the whole process, and when we are reaching out for candidates, we emphasize that point as well, encouraging people who may not be part of a represented group currently on the court to see themselves as being, a candidate of interest if they seek to be considered.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Sarai. That concludes your time. I will now go to Monsieur Fortin for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To begin with, I would like to thank you, Ms. Campbell and Mr. Lametti, for being with us here this morning to discuss these very important issues. You are both eminent jurists, highly recognized, of course, as such, and I'm convinced that your contribution to the legal system is of the highest quality. But I have a question for you. Let me begin with you, Mr. Lametti. Look, Minister, I don't want to argue with you. I merely want to address an issue, picking up on the question put by Mr. Cooper regarding the use of Liberal List or any other partisan information. I think I understood from your answer, perhaps I'm mistaken, that you did not, when it comes to the nomination of Justice Jamal, checked his political allegiances, either to Liberal List or anything else. Is that correct? And if you prefer not to answer, of course, that is your right. Of course, you can simply tell me you'd rather not answer my question. But please don't waste my few precious minutes by just speaking around the question or against the grain of my question. If I understand correctly, you did not use Liberal List or any other process or procedure to check the political allegiances of Justice Jamal. For a nomination to the Supreme Court, the short answer is no. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Because I nominated him to the Ontario Court of Appeal as well. That was at the beginning of my mandate as a minister, and I used the process required there at that time, and I verified his merits, his qualities, very clear qualities, and then I concluded that I should nominate him to the Ontario Court of Appeal, directly to the judiciary there. And we used, as I've just described to the other member of the committee, Mr. Cooper, a number of tools for this nomination that allowed us to better understand and know the candidate. There were other candidates surely on your short list. Did you verify the political allegiances of the other candidates? Hang on, we're just confusing two issues here, perhaps, with all the respect. Do you, sir, for the nomination to the Supreme Court, my role in this procedure was to take the short list and consult, carry out checks based on that short list. And as I've said, we did not use anything for that nomination. No. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Is it possible to learn quickly, yes or no, as of which date you're no longer using Liberal List? As I said to the other member of your committee, Mr. Cooper, this was announced in a newspaper, so I don't know what the source of that information is. Honestly, I don't. So you're not confirming that? All right, so you can continue using it if you wish. Is that right? I have no opinion on this. I have no opinion on the source of the article. Yeah, right, but I'm not asking about the source. Is this news true or not? There is no news. I used the process as required from, as I said to Mr. Cooper. Yes, but the list. I'm not infirming or confirming the list, the news, given that it's not from my office. Ah, I see. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Ms. Campbell, with your permission, I have a few questions for you. Ms. Campbell, I imagine you do hear me. So, I believe that Justice Jamal, from what I have heard, I don't know him personally, is an excellent candidate and is well nominated. He seems to be a highly competent justice with a broad personal experience and will surely be able to contribute significantly to the Supreme Court and to the law of the land. So, in this selection process, Ms. Campbell, could you tell me whether you at any point looked into the political allegiances of any of the candidates?
Okay.
We have access to the judgments that they think are among the most important, or if they are not members of the judiciary, articles or things, so we can see their philosophy. And some of the questions on the questionnaire give them a chance to talk a little bit about their philosophy, how they see the role of a judge, but never we're not the least bit interested in that. I actually think it's kind of a mug's game, because the notion that the way that somebody votes in their civilian life will reflect the way they decide cases is actually not a very empirically well established thing. So we don't interest ourselves in that at all. No.
Merci, Madame Campbell.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. So I understand from you that, to your mind, this would not be a good idea, having someone nominated based on their political ideas or political tendencies. Is that right?
I think if some, kind of out in, some extreme area of judicial thinking, you might not want to appoint them. But I think the biggest concern that I had, certainly when I was Minister of Justice, and as I say, I was the Minister of Justice in Mr. Mulroney's government. I don't know what was Rosalie Abella's partisan view. I appointed a lot of interesting people. I had no idea what their partisan view was, or if they even had one. But I think the important thing is competence and character, the willingness to do the job, the temperament suitability. And Justice Jamal is a superstar, recognized by people right, left, and center as a superstar, as a legal thinker, but also having personal qualities of extreme collegiality. I understand that on the Ontario Court of Appeal, where the judges sit in panels, that other judges are delighted to be appointed to be sitting with them on a panel. These things are really important for the functioning of the court, this ability to work with others and to find consensus. It's a
On vous perd, Madame Campbell, désolé. On peut pas...
So sorry, we're losing you. Thank you. Madam Chair? I'm so sorry, Mr. Fortin?
La Présidente?
Yes, but I have a point of order, please. From the outset, unfortunately, the witnesses' responses are sometimes cutting out, yet their answers are so interesting. I'm so happy to be here to hear them. Is there any way to ensure that the witnesses have the right equipment before we get going with adequate sound tests? Because now I've lost some of Ms. Campbell's answer. Same for Mr. Lametti's. This is very unfortunate. It's very important to be able to hear our witnesses. I would like us to be able to ensure that we are testing witnesses adequately to ensure that communications are appropriate to our roles.
Monsieur Fortin, I'll confer with the clerk and make sure that that we are staying on top of the equipment for our witnesses. I do see that both of our witnesses have proper equipment. Move on to Mr. McGregor. Please go ahead, sir. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome Minister Lametti and Ms. Campbell to the committee, and we really appreciate having you both here to discuss this nomination process. Minister Lametti, maybe I'll start with you. Just offer congratulations on the royal assent that Bill C-15 received yesterday. I had the honor of serving with Romeo Saganash in the previous parliament, and so this has a deep personal meaning to me, but to many Indigenous people across this country. I wanted to ask you, in Bill C-15's preamble, it does talk about how the declaration emphasizes the urgent need to respect the legal systems that Indigenous peoples have. And, Clause 5 of that act requires that the government is going to take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the declaration. Within the qualifications and assessment criteria, number one, under a demonstrated superior knowledge of the law, it does say that knowledge of Indigenous legal traditions may also be considered. And maybe Ms. Campbell, you might want to chime in on this. I just wanted to know, with respect to that qualification and assessment criteria under number one, the knowledge of Indigenous legal traditions, can you expand on that a little bit more? I wanted to know how much that framed into your consideration of applicants, given the context we're now operating under in Canada, where Indigenous rights and title are becoming much more prevalent in Canadian society, and will certainly be a big part of legal decisions going forward, especially with the passage of Bill C-15.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Just before turning it over to Ms. Campbell, thank you for the compliments on C-15. I thank you, and I certainly have saluted the leadership of Romeo Saganash throughout this whole process, and I think he is deserves a great deal of credit for the passage of C-15. He did a lot of advocacy for it in the meantime, in addition to his own private member's bill. We as a government recognize, I as a Minister of Justice recognize that we need to work hard at improving the justice system in all of its forms. That means, as per the UN Declaration, helping in the reflourishing, if you will, of Indigenous normative systems. I have just recently announced under Call to Action 50 $20 million for funding across $10 million for funding across Canada, 20 projects aimed at reviving specific Indigenous justice systems. So that's part of it. Part of it is encouraging better access to justice. Part of it's encouraging a better justice system, more participatory justice system. Part of it is more Indigenous justice. And I have done that too, appointing Indigenous justices to the Superior Court and elevating currently sitting Superior Court judges to the Courts of Appeal. And it's a priority for us as well to make sure that representation at its earliest possible point also extends to the Supreme Court of Canada. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Campbell.
Well, I would just say that the committee was very keen to, if possible, find an Indigenous candidate. There's still the challenge of language. The language, there is bilingual functionality among Indigenous people, sometimes with judges that are still, or lawyers that are still junior. I said this the last time, that I do believe that within the next 4 or 5 years, we will see an Indigenous candidate on the Supreme Court of Canada. But I also think that there has been a very significant recognition of the importance of non-Indigenous justices on the court to be literate in these issues. And so even, for example, the Honorable Malcolm Rowe, who came from Newfoundland and Labrador, where that is not an area of the law that is necessarily well developed, his own involvement in an organization called Action Canada, which had taken him across the country, where he'd gotten to know the Indigenous leaders in Haida Gwaii, in Nunavut, and places. He was very curious, very interested, and very cognizant of the importance. Justice Sheila Martin is hugely respected by Indigenous communities and has taken that area of the law something very, very important for her. It's less an issue in Quebec because the issues are not so well developed in the law there, but certainly in Western Canada and in Ontario and in Atlantic Canada. So I think what we're seeing is a growth of Indigenous people as lawyers, but also a growing recognition on the part of non-Indigenous lawyers and jurists that this is an area that they must engage with, that it is and I think the difference between now and, for example, when I was Minister of Justice, I convened a national symposium on Aboriginal justice with the Minister of Justice of the Yukon. And I think that the thinking has changed dramatically since then, where we are looking at not just understanding Aboriginal rights as they are in the Constitution, but this whole indigenization of our legal thinking. These are exciting and challenging times, and we have people in the country who can make great contributions to this. And I firmly believe that this will be seen on the Supreme Court of Canada. But the Supreme Court is not the only place where these skills and talents are very valuable in terms of the development of our legal system and culture.
Thank you to both of you for those.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGregor. You were right on time. We'll now go to our second round of questions, starting with 5 minutes for Mr. Moore. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of you for being here today on what is a very important process. Minister Lametti, maybe for the benefit of those watching, how many provinces have a guaranteed number of seats on the Supreme Court?
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Only one by in terms of the Constitution, which is Quebec, which is 3 in recognition of the unique nature of the civil law component, which is different from the other 9 provinces and 3 territories.
Thank you. And
that being said, there is a tradition, if you don't mind me finishing, Mr. Moore, there is a tradition that 3 judges come from Ontario, 2 judges come from Western provinces, and 1 judge comes from Eastern provinces. That has been softened from time to time historically, but for the most part, it has worked in that fashion.
And I understand that. Thank you, Minister. Why then did you mention that in your search that there would only be a search conducted from potential candidates from Ontario?
Well, the idea was just respecting that tradition. Obviously, other candidates could have applied. Other candidates could have applied. There was nothing barring, but it was listed as a criterion.
And that makes sense to me 100%. So my question is, when Justice Cromwell retired, your government, who is an Atlantic Canadian member of the Supreme Court of Canada, your government put no such search restriction that the replacement for Justice Cromwell would be an Atlantic Canadian. And as an Atlantic Canadian, that concerns me because since Confederation, Atlantic Canada has always had 1 member on the Supreme Court of Canada. So why is it that when there was a vacancy in Ontario, you only searched for Ontario applicants? And I think you've done a wonderful job finding a very qualified one, but why is it when there was a vacancy in Atlantic Canada, the search was nationwide rather than just limited to Atlantic Canada?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Moore. I can't actually speak. I wasn't the minister at that point. I can't actually speak to the process. That was our one of our earlier processes. What I can say is the result of that process was Justice Rowe in the province of Newfoundland. So I can't speak to the way in which the criteria were formulated there because I didn't take part in those discussions.
Thank you, Minister. I think it's important for us to recognize the diversity of our country and that Atlantic Canada plays an important role, and future vacancies in Atlantic Canada on this most important institution should be filled by Atlantic Canadians. And Madam Chair, how much time do I have?
You have 2 minutes remaining.
Okay. Minister, we are a committee of parliamentarians, and the Justice Committee, as the Right Honourable Kim Campbell mentioned, is an important committee, and none of us take for granted the privilege that it is to be a member of this Justice Committee. There was a recommendation couple years ago by the Justice Committee that the committee that looks at a new nominee for Supreme Court of Canada be a true committee of Parliament chaired by a member of Parliament. And I think, for example, our chair of this Justice Committee, when we meet with Justice Jamal later today, that should be a parliamentary committee that has the same rights that we do and the same ability to question, and not chaired by someone from outside of Parliament. That doesn't make sense to many people. I wonder if you have a comment on why that recommendation hasn't been implemented yet.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. I'm aware of that recommendation. My understanding of the nature of the session this afternoon, right now, is a true parliamentary committee, and therefore we're subject to the usual rules of parliamentary committees, including rules, and that's perfectly fine. And I answer questions in that vein. My understanding of the nature of the session this afternoon is a get to know the candidate better session. The Supreme Court appointment process is in the hands of the Prime Minister. Ultimately, Madam Campbell and her committee. Ultimately, I, as Minister of Justice, in conducting consultations on the shortlist, are only making recommendations to the Prime Minister. So my understanding, this is this was the preferred view of that session that you will have the opportunity to have this afternoon with the proposed candidate. That is really just to ask the candidate questions and to get to know him or her better. And so it was felt that this should not be a normal parliamentary committee. And I think so far the process I've been through 2 processes thus far as Minister of Justice. This is my second. I certainly thought that the process went extremely well the last time around with Justice Kassirer. And from what I could see as a member of Parliament, it went quite well with Justices Rowe and Martin. These are unprecedented. They've worked very well. It gives transparency to the committee, and I think it works quite well to involve the general public in that, including a leading law dean, as we're having this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Lametti. Thank you, Mr. Moore. We'll now go to Mr. Maloney for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate this opportunity, very unique opportunity, in fact. Minister Lametti, it's always very appreciated when you appear before the committee, and today is a special occasion, so thank you. To the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, this is a unique opportunity for me to ask questions of a former Prime Minister. Let me start by saying that it was music to my ears when you uttered the words, "There has been no compromise on quality." This process and the process we're going through this afternoon is important. You started by referencing your disagreement with Bob Rae about the tap on the shoulder approach. Really what we're talking about is a method of appointment, because ultimately I've been a member of this profession for over 20 years. I think everybody will agree every appointment that we have made to the Supreme Court of Canada, regardless of the approach, has been of the highest caliber. Back in your day, when you were Minister of Justice and Prime Minister, I believe there was 3 appointments to the Supreme Court of Canada made using a former process. In 2005 or 2006, we introduced a new process. The government of the day created the body that we're going to see in action this afternoon. And in 2016, our current Prime Minister implemented the new process, which you are heading, and I thank you for that. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a climate politically that has become more polarized. And these processes sometimes open the door for that polarization to rear its head. And we've seen that today, and we've seen it before. We're having discussions about, some people, they premise their questions by saying they're all excellent candidates, including the one we're here today to talk about, and then they proceed to undermine the process. The purpose of this committee hearing and the purpose of this meeting this afternoon is to show Canadians that we have a strong court, we have a strong process, and that we're always striving to make it better. So my question to you is, and we haven't really discussed the process this afternoon that's going to take place. What is your view on the evolution of the approach from the tap on the shoulder approach, as you've characterized it, to the process we have now? I would love to hear your views on how it has progressed and how it has improved.
Well, I would say very briefly that as a member of a group that often didn't have shoulders that were seen as very tappable and were underrepresented, when I was Minister of Justice, 25% of my judicial appointments were women. But the percentage of people at the bar who were tenure called, who were women, was only 12.5%. So I actually appointed women disproportionately to begin to create a body of people who could mature and become candidates for higher appointments. But I think what we're seeing with this approach, and again, there are many different ways to do this. What I see in the approach that the Prime Minister asked me to chair is a reflection of what has already been taking place in the provinces. And when I was Justice Minister, people could apply to be considered for the court. There were local judicial review committees that were consisted of people from the legal profession, from law enforcement, from a variety of different groups appointed by province, appointed by the federal government, to try and make them not party pre to any one particular group, but to vet candidates and determine whether they were fit to serve. And then the minister there was a time in this country when they didn't have any of that, when it really was much more a question of perhaps patronage, and which didn't mean that a lot of good people were not appointed, but a lot of good people were also excluded from consideration. So I see this as in many ways a reflection of what goes on to the appointments with the appointments of the superior courts in all of the provinces, and an opportunity for people who are knowledgeable about the law. And it's quite a lot of work. I mean, if a committee took this on, you'd have an awful lot of work to do on it, because it takes a long time to review all of the applications, etc. But it is the idea of taking it out of a partisan process. But I don't see any reason why there can't be other ways of doing it. But I do think that what this process does is it says to people in the legal profession, anyone may be asked to be considered. That's pretty new. Because there was a time when many people would thought, to be asked to be considered, it would have been considered laughable. Who are you? Who do you think you are? Well, if you are a person who meets these criteria, you bloody well have a right to be considered. And you know what? We will give you the fairest possible review possible. And we will work very hard to try and make sure that every person gets a chance to get a fair hearing and a fair evaluation, recognizing that we can't send all of the names to the Prime Minister, and there will be, the separating out of people. So I see the evolution as one that is really consistent with the appointments to the courts, the superior courts in the provinces. And I think that that things, changing the process to make sure that there's more time for people to apply. We've done that. Reaching out broadly to beat the bushes for people to think of themselves as possible candidates. And this I think is appropriate. But I'm not setting the terms of reference for the committee, but I would, believe that the Prime Minister and the Minister and others would be very open to other suggestions to make it done more broad. There's also the question of, it is the Prime Ministerial prerogative to make these appointments. And I think to the extent that prime ministers are willing to not necessarily fetter their discretion, I don't think they should do that, but to open up the process and to ask others' advice. I mean, they've always asked others' advice, but to have people really seriously focus on candidates, many of whom are self-selected and turn out to be terrific, I think that's a step forward. So, you're thoughtful, and I think that many of you may have thoughtful approaches of how to make it better. But I think, as with the Superior Court appointments in the provinces, I think taking that out of a purely partisan forum gives it credibility and makes it more open to people who are not part of any kind of, partisan power group.
Thank you. That concludes your time, Mr. Maloney. I will now go to Monsieur Fortin for 2.5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question will be for Ms. Campbell. It's not every day that we get to have you, the chairperson of the Independent Advisory Board for the Supreme Court Committee Judicial Appointments, with our committee. It's an honor to have you here. And of course, at Justice, we cover a number of important issues we do in the House as well, and you're fully aware of that. There's a subject that's been of great importance to me recently, and I mentioned it earlier. It is the process of nomination. I would like to hear you on it. As chairperson of the IAB, given your experience as well, including your political experience and experience as a jurist, and I'm sure that you have excellent judgment in all these matters, I would like to know a little more about how you review or evaluate the political allegiance of applicants. I heard from Mr. Lametti that there was no review of this, given that he had already nominated or appointed Justice Jamal to an Ontario court. So, well, in any case, what's your view of all this? Would it be important to evaluate political allegiance for whatever reasons, valuable reasons, less relevant reasons? Should this be carried out as a candidate, an applicant is being reviewed? Should this be a part of the process?
Process. We don't interest ourselves in it. We interest ourselves in competence and philosophy, and particularly as it is reflected in the way candidates have engaged outside of the legal profession. We're interested in what they've done in their communities, whether they have contributed to their communities. And of course, those who have been judges for a long time are more constrained in doing that. But, in terms of their philosophies, their exposure to the diversity of Canadian society, these things interest us. But we raise no issues that would relate to partisanship at all. It doesn't interest us. We don't pursue it, and we would consider it not appropriate for our deliberations.
Et à votre avis, est-ce qu'on peut plus...
Do you think that this is something that could be checked on a short list once that the IAB has done its work, or do you think this should never be considered?
Well, what happens with the short list is a prime ministerial mystery. And it is the Prime Minister's prerogative. But I can tell you that every person who is on that short list is a person of distinction and high character and great quality who could make an excellent contribution to the Supreme Court of Canada. So I would be surprised if partisanship played any role. If it did, it would be something quite aside from the already established outstanding evaluation of somebody in terms of their legal ability, their character, and their integrity.
Merci
Thank
beaucoup,
you.
Madame Campbell.
Thank you very much, Ms. Campbell.
Monsieur Fortin, we'll now go to Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Campbell, maybe I'll front load this with 2 questions and then allow you to answer both. I take to heart your previous comments about Indigenous candidates and the fact that there is increasing representation throughout the court system that we have in Canada. I guess what I wanted to know, first of all, is in the last several nominations that have happened over the last number of years, including this one, have you seen an improvement in the available pool of qualified Indigenous candidates for the Supreme Court who match all of the requirements? Is there an improvement happening in the number of people who could be qualified to that position? And secondly, every single time we go through this process, there's a time for reflection on what worked and what didn't. And you've done a number of these now. Do you have any comments about any improvements that can still be added to this process based on your most recent experience in this nomination? Thank you.
I think in answer to your second question, I don't really, except to simply constantly work to try and cast the net as broadly as possible to ensure that no one who could make a contribution is missed. And some of that is also perhaps a function of things like universal design, to make sure that questionnaires are designed in such a way that people get a chance to put their own case forward as well as possible, rather than simply being limited. We sometimes think that the way we frame a question works for everybody. It may not. So I think that there's that case. I think in terms also of Indigenous representation, yes, there are a growing number of people that we see. I think also, in a previous process, I remember having a discussion with Phil Fontaine of the Assembly of First Nations, and thinking that there should be perhaps an interesting discussion about whether should there be a seat on the Supreme Court of Canada for an Indigenous person. Of course, we have to remember that our Indigenous communities are very varied also. We have First Nations, we have Métis, we have Inuit people. How do we get that reflection? I think we will have members of those communities on the court, but I think it's also important that anyone who's on the court has the capacity to encompass those new ways of thinking about old obligations in our law. So, but I think we have a lot of interesting things to think about the role of our court. And I'm not somebody who's interested in change for change's sake, but I also live in a Canada which is very different from what it was when I was a young woman. Many things, and incidentally, I want to say that in things I was thinking just the other day that changes to things like LGBTQ rights, these Parliament led. in these changes. These were not changes that were led by the courts. So I think Parliament still has a very important role in as you did yesterday in the bill that was signed. I mean, I think that leadership comes from there as well, and that also has an impact on the court. So I'm giving you a long answer to a short question, which is simply to say that I am optimistic, but I also think that it's a time when so much is happening with respect to Indigenous developments in Canada, the creation of an Indigenous law program in Western Canada. I mean, that we are so much more open now, in the same way that we're much more open to LGBTQ rights than we were when I was young. I mean, all of a sudden, sometimes a lid gets taken off and we say, boy, have we been stupid about this? We better catch up to create justice in this area as well. And I think the reflection of indigenization, Indigenous values in our legal system is something that we need to think about. Is it enough just to have judges of Indigenous life experience, or should there be a more formal approach to it? I don't know the answer, but I'm really pleased that people are asking this question. At least I'm asking it. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Now, with the time remaining, I think we'll complete our second round of the complete second round. We'll go to Madame Findlay next for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for being with us today. It's good to see you again, Right Honourable Kim Campbell. I believe the last time we saw each other in person, I was moderating a panel, the panel in front of several hundred women lawyers in Vancouver, and the panel consisted of you and Justice Abella. So it was a great venue and a good time to celebrate being a woman in law. With that, I would just also thank you for outlining an appreciation with some insights of the challenges of life as a Supreme Court of Canada judge and the sacrifices, especially for those who would have to leave BC. I have to say that as well as a BC member. Minister Lametti, as a parliamentarian, I have participated in past Supreme Court recommendation processes, been part of interviews with the then Supreme Court of Canada Chief Justice and other senior jurists to vet applicants. The composition of the new independent advisory board effectively takes elected parliamentarians out of the equation until the stage we find ourselves in today. It replaces parliamentarians, with 7 nonpartisan members, 3 of whom are chosen by the Minister of Justice at the time, that is you, right now. Could you please explain to us why you believe this is the best way to pick a Supreme Court justice? And unmute yourself, please.
Who was that question directed to, Madame Findlay?
I said Minister Lametti.
Minister Lametti, please go ahead.
There we go. Sorry, I am having trouble unmuting myself on the ThinkPad that I'm using. I apologize for that. Thank you for the question, Ms. Findlay. There is one other element of the process where parliamentarians are consulted, and that's on the short list. And I undertake to speak with my critics and both in the House of Commons and in the Senate, members of the committee from a particular region or province. I did that in 2 processes that I participated in. So one focused on Quebec, this last one focused on Ontario. There is a non-disclosure agreement that is signed by people in these particular circumstances, but parliamentarians are consulted there. I think the merits of this process are I think I don't want to say obvious, but I do want to say evident. So first of all, a set of criteria that are published in advance that frames the work of the advisory board and allows our colleague, Mr. McGregor, to ask the precise question they did at the beginning of how the interaction of a certain criterion actually was applied by the independent advisory board. And it also frames the decision that the Prime Minister ultimately has to make. It allows for diversity of thought and representativity at the level of the board. allows for parliamentarians to be consulted, and then allows for the process we're going through now and the process that you will go through this afternoon. So I think there's a very good balance here of both identifying and evaluating good candidates, maintaining confidentiality, always searching for integrity, capacity, intellect, merit, as well as fostering diversity. So I think we have managed, I think, in a very transparent way to put together a very good process.
Thank you for that. I'm curious about your selection process, Minister Lametti, for the 3 members you appoint to the Independent Advisory Board. How were they selected?
Thank you. Again, we're looking to represent various voices in the community, and then full well knowing that other legal bodies would present people. It's also very important for us to get non-legal representation on that board. Such a capital role in our lives. It's not just for lawyers.
My question was, how did you choose them, sir?
We were looking for.
How did you choose those people?
On the criteria of representativity, diversity, and merit.
And are either of you concerned that where Justice Jamal, and obviously he's an excellent jurist, but are you either of you concerned that this will reduce the number of women serving on the Supreme Court as we lose Justice Abella?
Very briefly, please.
Just before I turn it over to Ms. Campbell, yes, it's one of the criteria. We do want to achieve gender parity on that court, and it remains an overarching priority.
Absolutely. There is another seat, Ontario seat, which will be up in 2022 when Justice Moldaver retires. These are difficult choices, and there is no question that this was a consideration. At the end of the day, the Prime Minister made a choice to have a new, a hitherto unrepresented or not present form of representation on the court, and those are difficult choices. But I think there's no question about it that this is a concern, and.
Thank you.
We give the Prime Minister the choice.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our last questioner for this panel. Mr. Virani, please go ahead.
So I want to say thank you to the Minister, and thank you to the Right Honourable Kim Campbell for being here with us. It is a distinct pleasure to have you and have your wisdom shared with the committee. To the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, I just wanted to ask you about this tapping reference that you made right at the outset, because I really think it encapsulates a lot of the barriers for underrepresented communities coming forward or being asked to come forward, because those shoulders are not traditionally the ones that are tapped, as you aptly put it. Can you talk about your analysis about how you get at the foundations of those kinds of concerns? Because when you work on diversifying the bench, and it's something we've committed to as a government, you find sometimes that there isn't the applicant pool. So where do you think it needs to start? Do we need to start at the law school level? We're encouraging people from underrepresented groups applying to become lawyers so that they can one day become puisne judges, to one day get to the point of becoming potential candidates for Supreme Court appointments, such as the one that is being proposed for Justice Jamal. So, Ms. Campbell, if you could refer to that.
I think all of the above. I think all of those things are important. I sometimes say that when I became Prime Minister, nobody who looked or sounded like me had ever done that job before. The same thing when I became Minister of Justice. And what you want to do is to create a sense of the ordinariness of a whole different variety of people who do certain jobs. And when we interviewed Justice Jamal in the course of our proceedings, one of the things he said was how, when he went to the Ontario Court of Appeal, how touched he was by the number of racialized lawyers and judges who looked to him. And he hadn't expected that. And it was very... And I think that all of these things, the more people you get, the more diversity of faces and views and backgrounds and realities, the more others see themselves reflected. So I think it starts at the bottom and it goes all the way up. And it means making sure when you're looking that you're not just tapping the shoulders that are the most familiar to you.
And if I could follow up briefly on one other point, that is, traditionally we also find when recruiting members to the bench that there are some traditional barriers. Some people might feel awkward. Well, maybe it's not for me. There might be financial barriers. You think about Bay Street lawyers coming from a firm like Justice Jamal's. Having practiced in Toronto, I understand sort of sometimes that's a very real concern. What kind of obstacles are you encountering even in this recruitment process? And I understand that an elevation to the Supreme Court of Canada should be the absolute topping career achievement for virtually any lawyer. But if you could perhaps provide us with some insights about some barriers that you're still encountering from those who might be erstwhile candidates.
Well, I think geographical has been very significant because of the requirement to live in the National Capital Region. I can't speak for the financial one. There was once a case in Vancouver where a very distinguished lawyer got named to the court, and his wife said, "Do you have an idea how much a judge makes?" And he had to scramble to try and get himself unappointed when he realized that he wasn't prepared for that salary cut. But most of the people who apply obviously are aware of what it will mean, and if they've been earning a lot of money, they're quite prepared not to, and if they're going to get an increase, that's good too. But I think the geographical, and I think the fear of the loneliness of it, because many of these people who are candidates and these successful judges are very sociable people. They're in the law because they care about people and they see the law as a way of making people's lives better. And the constraints on a Supreme Court of Canada judge in terms of how they socialize and, they have to go home, sit around the bar and, chew the fat people. I think for some, that's also a concern and how that will affect them. But one of the things we find, and we ask the how do you anticipate making the transition? And most of them have had serious discussions with their families, with their children. They're quite realistic about what it will be. And I've suggested that it would be great if we could get some retired justices from the Supreme Court to go out and do public events around the country talking about that life, to try and answer people's questions and meet their doubts. But at the end of the day, for some people, it is a significant sacrifice, and some are willing to do it and some are not, just as like many lawyers want to be judges and others don't. So it's a matter of making sure that nobody who could make a contribution would want to is deterred from putting themselves forward. That's the key, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Virani. That concludes your time. And at this time, I'll just thank Minister Lametti and the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. Ms. Campbell, you have blazed trails that people like myself walk through now. And I can't begin to tell you how much we appreciate all of your hard work and your dedication to service to our country. Thank you so very much on behalf of all committee members and myself for being here today.
Point of order.
The rule of law is the most important thing in democracy, so thank you all for being part of that process.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, did I hear a point of order?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I don't want to disappoint our guest, particularly Minister Lametti, but I thought we were meeting for 2 hours on this topic and then going into committee for half an hour for the study that we're dealing with.
You are in that the meeting itself is 2 hours long, and so we have to go in camera now, and we have to take into account those 15 minutes that it takes to suspend and then to go log into the in-camera meeting as well. So I hope you'll indulge, and I'm really looking forward to completing this report today. And I know that there's a number of things that we need to discuss specifically with that report. So with members' permission, we'll go ahead and we'll suspend. Your code, your Zoom link should be in the email that you received for the link for this meeting as well. Okay. Meeting is now suspended. Thank you very much, Ms. Campbell. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.